Good afternoon. We are really glad you could join us today for this automation webinar. As you know, we're going to be discussing more of the risks involved with economic development in relation to automation. So we have with us today Will Cookson, who is the Director of Economic Development for Emsi, and also Duncan Brown, who is our Senior Economist. We have the opportunity to answer some questions if you have any, so please put them in the box on your control panel and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Will. Good afternoon, Will.
Good afternoon, Debbie, and good afternoon to everyone that has joined us. Obviously, if you're listening to this later and listening to a recording, welcome as well. Yes, so today this is the second of our automation webinars. We're not going to go over the ground that we covered on the webinar that took place on the 12th of November. We will share a link on the follow-up email that you'll get after the webinar. So you can have a look at that. That one gave more of a feel for the methodology that we'd used and the approach that we've taken, and summarise some of the findings. Today we're going to dig into the automation issue and our report more from an economic development perspective. So yes, we published our Autonation report. That is the title, it's not a typo. Essentially what we're doing is we're looking at the potential risks and opportunities that automation could bring to the labour market, and looking at that down to a local authority level. So very much a local picture of where and how automation can potentially impact on the labour market. If you haven't seen the report, I'll share a link later on, and on any follow-up emails we'll share the link to the report. For anyone listening later, you can go to our website, you can download a copy of the report. So yes, quick introduction to Emsi for those of you who don't know us. Our ethos and our purpose is to provide better insight using labour market insight or labour market information to help you to make better decisions. And we do that working with a number of different organisations across education, employment and economic development. So the agenda today, introductions. We're then going to have a look at task exposure and job exposure and what's the difference. We're going to look at the challenge of high exposure jobs. We're going to look at potential response options. We'll take some questions and we'll tell you where you can find out more. So before we get started, we have a poll which should be appearing now. So, do you perceive that your overall exposure to automation locally is? Select one of the following options, high, medium or low. And this is really just to get an idea of your perception. I'll give you a little bit of time to complete the poll. We are collecting responses, I've been told.
You could do a countdown, Will, if you like, to the end of the poll.
How long do we give people, Debbie?
It's up to you.
92% of people have voted, so I think at 86% it's going down. People are withdrawing their votes, and the poll has closed. So 25%, oh, you can see, 25% high, 75% medium, and 0 low. So the overall perception is automation locally is an issue and something that needs to be understood, which is great because that's what we're going to be talking about today, and that's what our report really looks at. I feel like we've done introductions, but it's probably worth introducing Duncan Brown again, our senior economist, who's going to take us through some of the findings within the automation report, but very much things that we think would be relevant to our customers in the economic development world.
Thanks, Will. So yeah, we're going to start off with a couple of pages from the main report. And today we're going to just be focusing on a particular aspect of it. Last week we did the kind of the general walkthrough. but we just wanted to focus on one particular aspect. So in the report, there are two, there's more than two actually measures that we focus on, but two that are kind of quite similar but have different results. And we thought it was worth unpicking what those differences mean as well, because they do have quite a big implication in an economic development setting for thinking through the implications of technology change, really. So the first one is this one that's on the screen now, which is about the task share. So what we do here is we slice up every job in the economy by the typical share of time spent in tasks which are of high, middle and low exposure to technology change. And then we add up all those shares of time across the whole economy. And what you see there is that certain areas across the Midlands and a little bit sort of into East Anglia as well tend to lead, with Anglesey there as well. And so that's quite an interesting view. And what it does is it gives you a sense of the total exposure of the economy, regardless of where that work takes place. But we have a different measure, which is quite similar. So if you go on to the next one, which is about job share. So if the previous one was adding up all of the working time spent across everybody in the economy on high exposure tasks, what job share does is slightly different. It says that which of the jobs in the economy have more than 70% of their time in those high exposure tasks? Because of course, say your economy on the previous measure is kind of 30% average. Well, it could be that every job has 30% average in it. You know, so every job has a third of its time that could be displaced by technology. Whereas with this one, what we're saying is we only care about the jobs which are really high exposure, the ones where most of your time, more than 70% of your time, could be done by technological solutions rather than by work. And of course, what that means is there's quite a big difference in implications, because on the first one, if you've got a nice even spread of task time, then it could be that actually, technology change is just going to change everybody's work a bit, and you can bank the productivity change, and that's great. Whereas with this one, these are the jobs that are actually in potential peril from technology change. If more than 70% of your time at work could be replaced by technology in some way, and it's important to think that this isn't just the colloquial robots. It could be that better materials allow your job to be done much more easily than it was before. It could be that organizations are able to run differently because of different technologies, which means that your job is no longer as needed as it used to be. But yeah, if your job is more than 70% taken up by those kind of tasks that could be replaced by those technologies, well, that means that your job could be at risk from technology. And risk's a word that we've tended to avoid here, but it does really take on a meaning of its own. And one of the things that's worth saying is that although there's that similar kind of Midlandy, East Anglia sort of geographic pattern, the areas involved are slightly different here. And so if we go on to the next slide, what we've done here is we've plotted every local authority across Great Britain by both of those measures. So the percentage share of tasks with high exposure, which is about 30% national average, hence the vertical line there, and jobs, and the number of jobs with high exposure. So these are the jobs with more than 70% of their time in tasks that could be at risk of technology change. And so what you see is that the two are correlated. Certainly that's true, but they're not exactly correlated, and you do get some outliers. So if you look at somewhere like, say, Wokingham, by being above the sort of the main herd, even though its actual number of percentage share of tasks is quite low by comparison with the national average, its actual number of jobs at high exposure is just above the national average. And so what that means is that actually most jobs in Wokingham are really, at sort of low exposure, but there's a significant lump of them, about 1 in 8, that are actually at high exposure. And you can see those St Albans there and St Edmundsbury, which are both high in task terms, but also really high in job terms. So more than 1 in 5 jobs are in this high risk category. And then you've got these other areas, so South Holland, Mid Devon, Copeland, where the reverse is the case. They've actually got a sort of a widespread level of exposure in task terms, but actual number of jobs that are at high risk is quite low by comparison, and so there it's much more evenly spread even than the norm. So what we're going to do from here is just pick out one of these areas, St Albans, where actually you've got a lot more jobs which are high risk in this way than the task number suggests, because it's got quite significant labour market implications, because it suggests that the sort of the areas exposure to technology change is concentrated in a relatively small number of jobs, and so they face a lot of the risk, whereas the rest of the workforce faces a relatively smaller risk. And so those ones in that latter category, they're fine, we can manage those. It's kind of smaller changes will happen because of technology. Jobs will evolve in what they do, and so we can think about it in terms of finance workers, spreadsheets coming along, and over time financial software means that they can do less of this sort of the more laborious stuff and focus more on the more important analytical stuff, and that's what most workers will be into. But what we're concerned here about is this kind of subset of jobs where actually the whole job could be wiped away by technology change, and we're concerned about an area like St Albans, which actually has quite a lot of them. More than 1 in 5 jobs in the local authority district there are at this level. So if we go on to the next slide. So here we've got a sort of a local report for St Albans, so we can just begin to unpack it a bit. So you can see again there, so the white dots on this these charts at the top represent the national level, and you can see that while it's a bit above this sort of the task share average, it's got 33.5% compared to 30%. It's a long way above the job share there, so it's 20% compared to 12.5%. And then we break that down into the sort of the significant jobs in the area. And so straight away, you can see that cleaners and domestics, which are 8,200 jobs in St Albans, so there must be some major contract cleaning operations in the local authority, I assume. So it's 8,200 jobs, and that's a location quotient of 4.6, so 4.5 times as many jobs as you'd expect to see in an area of this size. But 79% of the task time is automatable. So that's a really, really significant amount of it. And when you think about sort of the potential for new construction materials to be less cleaning reliant, robots to go and vacuum your floor, all these kind of things, you can see how that can happen. And you can see some of the other jobs in there. Industrial cleaning process occupations may not quite meet our really high exposed job category at 62%, but it is still quite high. And so if we go on to it's worth saying, by the way, that there's one of these local reports for every local authority and every LEP region in the land as well. So if you're interested in knowing more about your area, do get in touch with us through our website. But if you go on to the next slide. So what I've done here is just take another view of that same question. So I've broken down every local authority into the numbers of jobs in all the different 4-digit SOC occupations, and multiplied them by the amount of time taken within the job that's at high risk, and then taken the top 10 roles by that measure. And what you see is that more than half of the high exposure tasks in St Albans, so 52% nearly, is accounted for by just 10 roles. 10 occupations have half of the high risk of automation attaching to them. And this is the top 20. The grey line going down the page there at 36% is the national average. So every area has got its highly concentrated risk jobs. As you can imagine, there are certain jobs that there's significant numbers of them and they just carry a lot of automation risk. But St Albans is way up there at 52%. So more than half just accounted for by those 10 roles. So if you go on to the next slide, please, Will.
Sure.
So what I've done is set out those 10 roles for St Albans, and so these are the numbers of jobs in each of them. And so as it was hinted at by the local profile earlier, cleaners and domestics are absolutely critical here. So there's that 8,400, I think we found, jobs in total, and 72% of the task times, which of course translates to about 6,500 jobs at risk. So if 72% of cleaning time is automatable, and if that did happen and eliminated those jobs, and it might not do, it might be that there are other demands for that kind of labour if it becomes cheaper. But yeah, that's 6,500 jobs, so straight away you can see it. I think it's basically about a quarter of the automation risk applies to just that one occupation in St Albans, and then you can see others there: kitchen and catering assistants, bar staff, sales and retail assistants, elementary storage roles are also quite significant, but that cleaners and domestic one is really there. So, you know, as I say, for whatever reason, there does seem to be a lot of cleaners and domestic roles in St Albans, and they are really at high risk of technology change. And so if you're thinking about economic strategy for that district, then you'd be thinking about, well, what do we do with these workers if technology change does come to pass over the next 10 or 20 years? A lot of these jobs that people are relying on, often quite low income people, for their prosperity, such as it is, and so therefore, you know, we need to make sure there's a plan to help them. And so if we go on to the next slide, there's another dimension that is worth thinking about. That cleaners and domestics is four square in this category that's high on automation risk, as we see here. It's kind of way up there in the top right hand corner, so this is on a percentile scale, but it's also one that we rely a lot on migrant labour to fill as well. And so to some extent, areas like St Albans are probably attracting a lot of migrant workers to fill these jobs that are actually in the long run possibly not sustainable given technology change. And so actually it really does call attention to what's the sort of the economic development model that you're going for, and are you kind of optimizing for jobs that are in that top right hand quadrant, which are, you know, generating lots and lots of jobs that you're then requiring migrant labour to fill, but actually technology change could make significant numbers of them redundant in the years ahead. And so it just gives you, some pause for thought really as to where you're taking this, because we are potentially sort of creating a sort of an at-risk worker group that we're sort of growing through bringing in labour from outside of the individual area. Go on to the next chart, the next slide. So in terms of what to do, first of all, you need to think about job alternatives. So difficult with this one because cleaners and domestics are, typically quite low skilled roles, but can the same skills be used in other less exposed jobs? On our analyst tool, we have a nice compatible occupations report, which allows you to enter a specific occupation and then just say, what kind of jobs could these people that are doing these jobs look to do elsewhere instead. And of course, one of the questions that this analysis raises as well is, can you find jobs that are also at lower risk of automation, or are you just moving people within a similarly exposed pool of opportunities, really? Then second, think about advice and guidance. The people that are in these jobs, it's really critical to help think about their other options and start them thinking about it sort of now, rather than wait just for technology to arrive and suddenly make their skills, unusable. And then third, think about the skill interventions. If there are only immediate opportunities in job terms or to other highly exposed jobs that could be at quite high risk of automation as well, well, maybe you need to think about what skills can be added that could complement what they already do to give them access to opportunities elsewhere.
That's really useful and interesting, Duncan. I think probably worth pointing out in terms of the advice and guidance, we do have a career coach tool which essentially uses our labour market information to really give an accurate view on career prospects or to inform career choices at a localised level. So looking at the opportunities within the local economy and then focusing on what the routes into and through those careers are. Really useful insight there in regards to how we need to think about automation at a local level. I just wanted to check whether we have had any questions.
No, you're obviously doing a good job. There's no questions. Being nice and
I hope that's what it means. But yes,
could mean that we've
our
confused
robot
people
here
with
ready
Morocco,
to answer questions, but yes, no questions were asked. Okay, so moving on, I just wanted to mention or re-mention a couple of places where you can find more information on this. Our report is actually available, not soon, but available now on our website. You can access the report and download it from there. You can also request localized reports. As Duncan mentioned earlier, those can be for a local authority district or for a LEP area. So just specify which areas you're interested in and we can share those with you. And I also wanted to mention that we're going to be at the IED conference on the 4th of December in London. Duncan will be speaking on the intersection of inclusive growth and productivity, which sounds grand, Duncan. I hope you're looking forward to that. We will also have a stand there. Do come and see us. Do let us know if there's questions that you have, if you want to talk through your localized reports in regards to automation or the talent attraction scorecards, which we shared with customers and organizations earlier in the year. But yes, do come and see us. We'll be there. I also want to mention our conference. So this is a save the date message. Our annual conference will be on the 13th and 14th of May in Birmingham, and we'll be looking at talent and linking talent supply and demand through using our labour market insight. Really, we've had great feedback on previous conferences. Yeah, do save the date and do come along. I think that's everything. So I just wanted to say thank you for joining us. Everyone that's attended will receive a follow-up email with links to where you can request your localized reports. And if you do have questions that occur to you after the webinar, do fire them across in response. So yes, thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Debbie. And thank you, everyone who attended.